Bye.
A couple of weeks ago, I set myself the challenge of completely rebuilding my deck. When I built this first version, I hadn't planned to use it for a hot tub, and now it's just not big enough. So I decided to make it better, which started with dismantling all of the parts and levelling the ground. That's where we've got to today. I've just come back from a week's holiday, hence the recap. There's also a huge number of new people who've joined us, so welcome. On my last video, I showed you that this wall had disintegrated at the base. So I scooped out all of the old soil and decided that I would rebuild it. I'm going to use some old stones that I had around the garden, so I don't need to buy anything new. This is such a good example of what can happen sometimes when you start a DIY and loads of other stuff kind of comes out of the woodwork. I took this deck apart so that I could make it a little bit bigger and discovered that my wall didn't have anything supporting it. It was just soil. What I do have, however, is all of these stones that were underneath the deck or in other parts of my garden that are left over from when I took down a wall inside of my basement. I'm going to reuse these to build up the wall. I'm not going to make this a perfect wall, because if you were building a wall you would dig down and install some proper footings. But because this is just a decorative wall, it's not supporting anything. If it were to fall over, it really wouldn't be that much big of a deal. I'm just going to put some rocks, some bricks underneath it and build it up, set them together with some mortar, and go from there. I'm going to do this before I put the deck, because if I don't do this now, it's likely to get a little bit worse with water ingress, especially with the deck being so close to where this is. That's how it ended up deteriorating as it did, because the deck was allowing water to go down and wash away the soil. Let's get started. Fortunately, I already have a lot of what I need, including sand and cement. It's probably a bit too much sand for what I'm making. I don't want this to dry out whilst I'm working because it's so hot today. Let's go with that. See what happens. The back of this, let me check it's in shot. Yes, it is. The back of this tells us how much of each material we need to put in, depending on what we're making. We are going to be making mortar, which consists of 1 part cement, 5 parts building sand. You can also make it with lime. I'm not making it with lime because I don't necessarily need this to be breathable. I do have some lime. Or you could. This is often used for making concrete. And the difference between mortar and concrete is that concrete has little stones that will increase the strength of the concrete. Looks like my mortar, it looks like my cement has dried out slightly in the bag, and it's got all of these lumps that I'm going to have to remove. It's not ideal. This cement's a little bit old, if I'm honest. Just mixing that in a little bit. Add a little bit more. You might be wondering, why am I mixing this with my hands? Well, I find mixing this with a spade quite challenging, quite difficult on my back. So I usually mix it together with some gloves. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this method because cement is not very good for your skin. And these gloves are not completely impenetrable towards chemicals like this. I'm making a small batch and I want to do it quickly. So whilst I do it this way and it works for me, I wouldn't necessarily say it was the best way to do it. I'm just mixing it in so it's a little bit mixed when I add the water. There we have some mortar. Okay. I'm going to be using a trowel to apply the mortar onto the stone. These stones were a little bit dusty, so I took some time to wash them down. If they're dusty, then the mortar mix won't stick. I also made sure to give the mortar mix another swift mix before I started. It can have a tendency for the heavier parts to settle on the bottom and the water rises to the top, so you need to give it a nice little mix. This first stone was a little bit too big for this space, so I actually dug out ever so slightly underneath it so that it would fit. And if you're looking at this thinking that this is the most untidy building of a wall that you've ever seen, then that's because you're correct. There's no style over substance here. I don't care if it looks pretty, I just want it to be supported. It's going to be out of the way anyway, it's going to be behind the deck. So much so that I even covered the entire wall with the leftover mortar that I had. I mostly just wanted to make sure that I had filled in all of the gaps with mortar, so that it stood a good chance of all sticking together. The amount of stones that I had was just the perfect amount. I was super pleased. The ones that didn't quite fit in, I used a hammer to convince them that they should fit. And if you're someone who builds walls for a living, I just want to apologise that this is happening to you. I jest. But sometimes it doesn't really matter how a job comes out. If you're not too fussed about how it's going to look, then just get it done any way that you know how. If this was an especially tall wall, or if it was supporting something, I would have handled this slightly differently, because that becomes more of a safety issue. You don't want a wall falling over when you least expect it. But this is just decorative. Adding the mortar onto the top, it gave the wall a flush look. I went back with my hands just to try and remove some of the finger marks that I've created. That way, when I go back and paint it at a later date, it's going to look just like a regular part of the wall. Next up, it was time for me to dig the remaining holes that the posts will be going into. I'm going to create 4 posts for this decking at the 4 corners. And just like the others, adding a breeze block to the base, which will act as a support for the post going in. In this area, there was previously a post cemented into the ground, so this was very easy for me to dig out. All 4 holes are now ready for the posts to be cemented into them. And here I was just using some stones to prop up this post to get an idea of what would be level. I'm trying to backwards engineer what I'm doing here a little bit because I want the posts to be eventually the same height. Because the ground on the left is higher than the ground on the right, I had to dig a bigger hole on the left so that they would be level. For example, if I needed to dig down 70 centimetres on the right, it would be about 90 on the left because the ground is higher. I want them to be level because I'm going to do something with the tops of them that I will share with you soon. That is where I got to today on this deck building journey. Next, I will be setting the posts in the holes and setting the base structure. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.